Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this discussion with the one and only Rainer Heufers. Rainer Heufers is going to be talking to us today, teaching us really about free markets and competition policy. So the idea is for us to understand free market principles, but within the context of competition, because it essentially defines the dynamics of the free market. And for classical liberal thinkers, it's an essential pillar for not only development, but also for creating free and prosperous societies. So before I get started, we're going to introduce Mr. Rainer Heufers. Mr. Rainer Heufers is a seasoned policy strategist, leadership mentor, and advocate for economic and governance reform. As the founder of the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, CIPS, and a global facilitator at the International Academic for Leadership and other organizations, he specializes in equipping individuals and organizations with strategic tools for impact change. His expertise includes policy, entrepreneurship, stakeholder engagement, and institutional transformation. With a focus on practical solutions, Rainer fosters innovative approaches that bridge the gap between vision and execution, ensuring lasting impact in governance, economic policy, and leadership development. So, Mr. Rainer Heufers is currently at the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. He's based in Berlin. So, welcome, Rainer.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I do need to correct that I'm not with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. I have been in the past, but I left a long time ago, and I'm in Berlin, but not with the Naumann Foundation.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, CIPS is, I know you're the founder and executive director of CIPS, right? And
Yes, yes.
we do follow you guys broadly because you guys also work very closely with policymakers to get things done, specifically in agriculture. And so, we see ourselves in you guys in what you do. And also, CIPS was like, I think it was listed as one of the think tanks to watch recently.
That's
I
right.
forget
We
by
were on our.
which organization, but yeah, we've been watching you guys long before the rankings. So, well, welcome once again, Rena. It's
Thank
good
you
to
for your kind
finally,
words.
it's good to have you here. So today, the point of this is to educate 15 free market fellows properly on free market ideals. These are professionals who are already working in the private sector, the entrepreneurs, the civil administrators, low to mid level. And so today I want them to think about competition not as a tool to protect your market, but it's something which, if designed, can actually generate positive network effects and prosperity for all. So before we get started with the questions, I want to just give you maybe 5 minutes. Why is competition important from a free market perspective? Or just, share us your starting thoughts before we get to questions and answers.
Oh, happy to do that. Maybe if you'd allow me, I say a little bit about my own bio in a way,
Yes,
because
yes.
my journey, why I am so much in favor of free markets, and here actually China played a larger role. This might explain why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I have studied Chinese in my very young years, and went there to actually work in the mid 1980s. And at that time, China had just embarked on their reform course. And I was still believing in the power of the government, and I was still believing we need a good amount of regulation, etc. And when I was there in China in the 1980s, I saw how many sectors were regulated. We had a dominance of the state-owned enterprises. We had no free prices. We had, a small private sector, but that was not able to compete with the heavy government apparatus. And at the same time, I saw people struggling to actually gain some wealth, come to prosperity. And that impressed me a lot. I saw how so many people are motivated to make a better life for themselves and for their communities. And when you describe the free market fellows that you're working with in Cameroon, This is pretty much the people that I met there that I admired in China, but they were facing this very strong government apparatus. And that's where I started to understand, no, what these people need is to actually go all the way, to found their businesses, to compete with each other, compete with the government if necessary, and actually produce enterprises, products, and services that actually help. And I mean, China is such a great example how far they have come in this endeavor. So that motivated me, and that also explains why I believe competition is so necessary and should not be stifled by any monopoly, be it a government monopoly or if you want a private sector monopoly. But that's something we need to talk about a little bit more in our
Well,
conversation.
Well, Rena, you say something very interesting, which I think sometimes advocates of free market forget that those who restrict competition isn't always the government, right? Because in some economies it can be the private sector who, either through mergers and acquisitions become the barriers to innovation and entry. So well, let's just go straight to the questions, and then of course you can expand on them. So Hayek obviously defined competition as a discovery process for dispersed knowledge. Now, how can this discovery process effectively function in a way, it effectively function for economies that are largely informal? Because African economies, like some economies in other parts of the world, are just highly informal. About 90% of our workers are still in the informal sector. So in that kind of economy, what role does competition play? Why is it important?
Yeah, this is a crucial question, and this is also a question, of course, that has motivated us and driven us in Indonesia. I mean, you're talking to a German, but nevertheless, I lived there for a long time. That's why I founded the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies. But yeah, the informal sector over there is maybe not as huge and important as in your part of the world, but nevertheless, it is still very important. And I think it's important to consider what's happening here. Consider yourself to be a very small entrepreneur. Let's say you just want to start a little coffee shop or maybe just a little stall on the street. Then you will have to think, so what's my benefit for going formal? And in most cases, there are no benefits to go formal. In most cases, the benefits are entirely to stay informal because you do not want to face a bureaucracy that might actually extract fees from you on a regular basis. You do not want to pay taxes and then you don't see that you get any benefit from these taxes. So you're faced by maybe responsibilities and duties, but not by benefits. But now you envision a different scenario where you uh, think about starting a little coffee shop or even just a stall on the street. But you know, if you register formally, you are protected by the law. You are able to open a bank account quite easily. That allows you to actually transfer funds to your suppliers. Maybe customers can pay more easily to you, etc., and so forth. So it's a very rational decision making by the entrepreneur. Shall I stay in the informal sector? Shall I go into the formal sector? And the formal sector can actually be disadvantageous to you if in the formal sector suddenly you are exposed to forces that you can't control and that are largely negative. When I talk about a small coffee stall, this might be just corruption, this might be just um, arbitrary kind of actions that you don't know how to control and how to factor this into your costs. But when you start a bigger business, then suddenly you might be facing enterprises that are very much supported by people who are close to the government. You suddenly might face an apparatus that is very, very powerful. And the moment you grow bigger, you become a threat to vested interests. So that's a big difference whether you are just on a very small level, the little coffee shop. And Peter Thiel wrote about that in one of his books. He said, when I start a company, and he's the co-founder of PayPal and so many of these big companies, Palantir, so many of these big companies. He said, I am not interested to start another coffee shop that is one of 10 coffee shops in the same street. When I
Yes.
start a business, I want to gain a monopoly. I want to be so good that
Yes.
nobody else can compete with me. And I want to be the only supplier and I want to make a lot of money with that.
But good competition policy should prevent that, right? Like Lina Khan, who was, I don't know whether she works for this administration, but she was so anti, mergers that actually reduced the ability of new businesses to come into the market. Because on the one hand, they say, a company like Amazon has improved the lives of citizens across the world dramatically. It's created this digital marketplace, which is what everyone wants. The buyers and the winners lose. But when you have a monopoly, it means that there's very little incentive for new people or new businesses to come into that market because the barriers to entry are just so high. When you look at Amazon and Uber, who can make losses for 2, 3 years, um, you know, at what point should we say we have to ensure that we protect the market for everyone? And at what point do we say, well, if the consumers benefit through lower prices, it's acceptable?
Yeah. This, I mean, now we're coming to the core of competition policy. And I mean, that's something that has been driving me and my work for a long time. So I would disagree with you, Henry, respectfully.
Yes,
So
yes, of course. No problem.
if you start a business and you're so good that you're better than anyone else, or you have
Okay.
technical solutions that nobody else has, you
Right.
will end up in a monopoly. You know, your monopoly might be completely small and insignificant. You might be the fishmonger in your market who's just better at selling fish, and then all the people come to you and buy their fish from you because you're just so much better. I don't know, you have better fish, or you there's more fresh, or the prices are extremely low, whatever. So that is not the problem. Also not in competition policy. If you are good and you are able to actually get the 100% market share, you have a monopoly. So far, so good. The question is, what do you do with your monopoly? So then we come to the abuse of market power, and that's one of the three pillars of competition policy. So abuse of market power. When you have 100% market share, or even if you have a lower share, but nevertheless one that allows you to control the market, and there are measurements for that, then you fall under certain measures of scrutiny where you are not allowed to engage in certain practices. That means you are that good. Let's say you are that good in selling fish and nobody else wants to buy fish from anyone else. That's fine because you are better and everything. But if you then start colluding with government agencies to say, listen, we should also not let new fish companies register in the market because clearly, you know, I have the network, I can serve everyone, let
Right.
nobody else come into the market.
Yes,
Then
yes.
you collude and you establish market entry barriers. That is where competition policy comes in and says that is not allowed.
Okay.
Or
So
if
competition
you,
policy is really about preventing one company from erecting huge barriers to entry, either by making it expensive or impossible for new companies to come because of, new licenses that they've created or all sorts of other approaches that they can use. So it's once the company
absolutely.
actually takes action. It's not the monopoly itself that's bad. It's once the company or the, entity starts abusing that market power, that's when it becomes an issue for competition.
Very well put, Henry. And if you just look at the case of Microsoft, they started to say, we want computers in every household in America. I think they were humble at the beginning, if I'm not mistaken, but don't quote me on that. I mean, they wanted to be in a lot of households. And that was an enormous progress at the time. Nobody had a computer in their house. That was an unbelievable mission to get computers in people's houses that they can use. So that's how Microsoft started. And pretty soon they had de facto a monopoly. Later, Apple came and challenged that. But basically, for quite a while, Microsoft was quite the dominant force in the market. That in itself was not a problem. They helped a lot of people to get computers, to get the software to work with, etc. The cartel, the competition authorities were not struggling with that. They were struggling if the Internet Explorer back in the days, that's an old case, that's already decades old now, was the one pre-installed on the computers, and there was another one, the Mozilla one that came to the market and said, we believe we have a better Internet Explorer, but Microsoft is somehow blocking us from getting into the market to have an alternative Internet Explorer. Well, then that is a so-called restrictive business practice. That is when the competition authority said, okay, here we have a case, and it went on for many years. The US government against Microsoft, whether they need to allow other explorers to also be able to actually, or internet browsers to actually be able to install on the Microsoft computers. So I find this distinction is very important. If somebody grows into a monopoly out of their own power, their ingenuity, their products and services, that is good as long as there are no market entry barriers.
Sorry, I was muted. So clearly it's a question about designing good infrastructures that encourage creative destruction, right? As Philippe Aghion was saying, and Joel Mokyr, that it's important that new firms can come in and innovate and change how things were done. So once we prevent that, then it's difficult for society and for individuals to be prosperous. So now I wanted to talk about local versus global monopoly power, right? Because some countries associate global monopoly power, immediately with market distortion and abuse of market power, which is why some countries didn't allow certain companies to come and set up shop, right? Uber was like run out of China. And now you have the likes of Thailand and Cambodia and Vietnam who are allowing Chinese EVs, but are requiring the local manufacturers to produce a certain amount of components, right? So because they don't want one company to come and like in the whole market. So where should regulators like prioritize their limited resources? Because what we found at CEPI is that when we go to regulators and we're like, okay, on data, like this is the most efficient, this is what we propose. On for the dairy market, this is what we propose. It's they don't have enough of the bandwidth. So given these limited resources, where should they, what should the focus be? Combating these foreign digital giants, not combat, I mean, that's what they're
Yeah.
doing, or dismantling their market dominance locally.
Yeah. I think we need to apply a heavy dose of pragmatism when it comes to this, because the world does not have free markets. It just doesn't exist. We
Yes,
have we have heavy subsidies in the United States for soybeans
for
and so many other products.
agriculture, for the energy sector, I mean, for crude
Absolutely.
oil, but also for EVs, right? So,
And
this year,
even and even the tech giants have received government support at certain stages of their development.
yes,
So there's no free market in that sense in the United States. There's also no free market, obviously, in China. They have also received heavy subsidies. It's slightly more in the spotlight than the American ones, but nevertheless, that's the
exactly.
case.
Whereas the
European
sizes might
Union is,
actually be equal if we're being quite honest about it. If one looks at the extent of the subsidies, because subsidies are not just money given to a company, right? On the one hand, it's a reduction in expenses, a reduction in taxes, tax rebates for engaging in certain activities.
yes,
So Shell, for
yes.
example, would receive a tax rebate for investing in renewable energy infrastructure and also receive a direct subsidy for drilling and selling at a particular price. So,
Yeah. So
yeah,
then here we are. You're sitting in a particular country, be it Indonesia, be it Cameroon or anyone else, but just not the United States, China, or maybe a big power in the European Union. So you sit there and you are faced with all these products and services that come your way and somehow have received government support, state support. So what do? Are you starting to ban Amazon or, join the fight to break up Google or, are you
or
doing this? Or do you do whatever you can so that your local industry actually slowly becomes more competitive? This is a very difficult process, and I'm not saying it's easy. It is not easy because you get the cheap technical solutions from the United States, you get the excellent payment solutions from China, you get very cheap t-shirts and shoes from China. The consumers would say, let's use all these goods that are already produced in the world. So where do you compete? Where do you grow? And our lesson is time and again, the government and we, the two of you here, Henry and I, we will not be able to actually say with what good and service can Cameroon or Indonesia compete against these giants. This has to come out of the domestic economy. We have seen that in so many cases when payment systems came out of Kenya or Tanzania. I'm not quite 100% sure. I think it
M-Pesa
was
was Kenya, Cameroon,
Kenya.
Central Africa was mobile
Yeah.
money.
So it
You
was
know,
a
yes,
it
it
was a
was a
local
revolution.
company.
Yeah,
It was absolutely, and it grew, if you want, out of nowhere because everybody was looking to um, Silicon Valley. Everybody was looking to the great delta in the south of China. So there, it's possible, but you need nurturing ground for these initiatives, and that's what free markets is all about. You are not able to compete with America, you're not able to compete with China. That's sad, but how do you become able to compete? You cannot fight the tech giants in America or the big subsidized electric vehicle producers in China. That's futile. You will never be able to break that up. So you have to do what's best for you and closing your market now. That's what the European Union is trying to do, closing the market and saying, okay, in that case, you're not allowed to sell on our
but Rainer,
territory.
we actually great example about the European Union because they reversed the ban on combustion engine sales by 2035. But in a
Yeah.
way, that actually, and raising tariffs on Chinese vehicles hasn't stopped the adoption of Chinese vehicles by European nationals. Now, the IEA actually released statistics recently about the adoption of EVs more broadly. And there's still about 1 million more electric vehicles were sold in the European Union, and a great deal of those were still imported from other countries. So tariffs in themselves, haven't delivered as much as the European Union thought it would. I now wonder whether it means that those tariffs have to be accompanied by other initiatives and incentives that allow them to develop, allows the likes of BMW, Peugeot, Renault, um, Polestar in Sweden to develop a bit more effectively. And because what I found with in terms of this competition, what we found is that China stopped giving out money to companies like that long ago. It told companies for solar panels, you must build the solar panels, generate the energy from them, connect them to the grid, and then you're going to get a subsidy. Whereas was still, I think in the West and much of Africa, it's still a question of, oh, here's the subsidy, see what you can create. With China, it
Yeah.
was if you can create an EV battery with less nickel and less minerals and reduce the use of minerals by 10%, then you get a subsidy. We are still investment in R&D and subsidizing that investment by 15, 25% to see what's created. There's no real objective behind it. And so I
Yeah,
wonder whether
exactly.
is that good or bad
That's
competition
exactly the
policy.
point, Henry. That's exactly the point. We have governments in the world that have effectively subsidized companies or their economy, but only if they had a clear objective. They needed to know exactly what they want to achieve. Singapore is one of those examples. They wanted biotech in the
Yeah.
country. They were aware this is a future technology. We need this. So they attracted world-class companies, engineers, skilled people to actually come and go into Singapore and grow it from there. But I mean, Singapore works very much with actual success indicators to see whether it works. Another good example is South Korea. Not long ago, South Korea was a developing country.
Yes, by
Now it's one of the richest countries
1970s,
in the
they
world.
weren't producing
Yes,
enough rice. They weren't producing
ex
enough food, and
exactly.
um, yeah, they liberalized because the Americans made them, right? When they were helping them rebuild, but they liberalized whilst also prioritizing their heavy industries.
Yeah,
Um,
but the way they did this, Henry, was to say, okay, we're going to give you subsidies, but our measurement of success is that you are going to make it in the international markets. So if you're able to prove that within a certain time frame, you're going to export X amount and you have a market share globally of X percent, then we're going to, continue with our support for this company. If you're not making it into the global markets, we're cutting it.
so
And this was a condition that, for example, in the country Indonesia, where I've been very long working very long time, they don't do that. They might actually support certain companies, sorry, they support certain companies, but not with an success indicator to
okay,
say,
yeah,
if you're so good that the world wants to buy your products, then we're with you. If you just continue to sell your products in the local market, and we have protected the local market for you, but you produce mediocre goods, you're producing it at prices above what we could buy globally, then why should we continue with this? So that was a very strong statement by the government in South Korea and a very strong incentive for companies like Samsung, etc., to go global. And
yeah.
they did. And look how successful they are right
Yes, I
now.
mean, they make Kias and they have, heavy and a bit of light manufacturing. So they're essentially like a blueprint, right? But Singapore, which is, our policy makers here love to tout Singapore, but know nothing about it. And they're an example of, trying to implement policies whilst having success indicators and not just
Yes.
implementing them in the void. Well, before we come back, I wanted to talk about state-owned enterprises and
Mm.
what they do for competition. Because we in Cameroon, they keep saying, "Oh, we're trying." Sometimes we act like the IMF. We're trying to get them to privatize everything, but that's because 96% of state-owned companies are loss-making right now. There's only
Yeah.
two to
Oh,
three
oh dear.
companies who make an okay enough profit to pay their staff and have like a bit to buy like machinery. So we're talking about companies who are barely breaking even. So what's the can state-owned companies be used to improve competition in the country? And if at all that is or isn't the case, how should policymakers these days in our globalized world and environment, how should they be thinking about state-owned companies?
Yeah. When it comes to state-owned companies, we come to a very interesting question, and that is, what is more important, competition or private property? I know for people like you and I, and probably the people that are in your fellowship, we value private property and competition. But is there a priority? Some people would argue private property is fundamental, therefore private property is more important. But when it comes to look at state-owned enterprises, I would argue competition is more important than private property. Because um, why would a government go for state-owned enterprises? Quite often there is a deep distrust in the private sector. The private sector might be actually the extended arm of the government already. So they are so close to the government that they are almost like government-controlled companies,
Yep.
but they are not delivering what the government wants them to deliver. So therefore, government says, in that case, we might as well just go in with a state-owned enterprise. Um, or, uh, sorry, lost my thread here. But the point is, if we have state-owned enterprises and they again monopolize the market, then usually we have terrible results. So if you have a state-owned electricity provider and there's just only one, so it's a monopoly, usually we get bad services.
Yes,
Same
like
if it's
us
a
in
state,
Cameroon. we're very lucky that we haven't like, the electricity hasn't disappeared already. But the moment the state controls electricity, water, the quality just becomes worse. When the English partly own the electricity company, at least we knew that, we can go, you would have like outages for 12 hours a day, 12 hours a month, right? And it wouldn't be so bad. But since the state has taken over, the quality of the service has become worse broadly.
Yeah.
So
And
this,
it's usually because it's a monopoly. Because
yes,
there are countries, many of them, where you have several state-owned electricity providers, and you would allow them to compete with each other. It might be the starting point that you say, I'm making this up for Cameroon, but that you say, okay, we have a South Cameroon and an East and a West and a North Cameroon state-owned electricity provider. So maybe you end up already with four in your country. And then you say, okay, if the one in the north is better than in the south or the west or the east, and I'm saying this without knowing anything about Cameroon, but I'm just saying, you could have geographical companies and then let them compete and sell in the other territory. That creates a level of competition. And then we're back to your very early stage statement by Hayek about competition as a discovery process. So if suddenly that state-owned enterprise is better run than the other state-owned enterprise, they might actually then outcompete each other, and the one that delivers better services, more reliable, maybe lower prices, might actually win. So suddenly we have a market economy between state-owned suppliers. Sounds a bit strange, but it's actually the case in many countries. And this, to me, at this point, has superiority or has a priority over just privatizing. Because if you privatize a monopoly, what you often get is a private monopoly by
yes.
a government-linked person.
And they'll
And
still
with
be
this,
benefiting from some form of
you have not won
subsidy.
anything. Yeah, you have not won anything. You've just moved to another type of monopoly, and the people will be very disappointed
But
and will believe it's the private people who do this. But in fact, it's actually a government-controlled monopoly.
well, if you take the internet, for example, it's currently we're trying to get the government to allow Starlink, Elon Musk Starlink to come into
Yeah,
Cameroon. It's been an uphill battle for the last 2 years, but simply because the government owns the monopoly on communication. So Camtel is a national provider, and they don't want to allow any other company to come in because they're scared that they would lose market share and whatnot. And we keep reminding them that if they don't allow companies to come in, then the service is not, there's no incentive for the service to get better. And we, the consumers, we don't have access to better prices and better quality service. As simple as that. So we're hoping that in 2026 it does. We've shown clearly how if we lower internet costs, businesses have more resources to invest in other things. And
yeah,
startups can actually survive a lot longer if they're not spending, $85 on internet. Because they can use that money to actually invest in packaging or maybe boost posts on social media and find new clients. And so we've shown, demonstrated clearly that there is an additional benefit to allowing new companies to come into the communications market.
yeah.
That's just an example I wanted to share.
Exactly. Absolutely. So when it comes to state-owned enterprises, back to that question, I don't believe that privatization directly is a solution. We have seen this in many cases in different forms of privatization. Generally speaking, that didn't really work very well. Um, what works much better is if you introduce competition to the market, ideally between private operators. I still think that's the better version. But if that's somehow politically not feasible, then at least a competition between state-owned enterprises. And I mean, the benefits we have seen in so many cases. We have seen the Americans have deregulated under Ronald Reagan their airline, their air traffic market, 1980s, I believe. And suddenly the monopoly that you had between Pan Am and TWA and I don't know, two or three companies were basically having the market under their control. Now suddenly you had so many different airlines, the prices came down tremendously, the services was much better. In Germany, where I been back in the days, we had a telecom monopoly. So one telecom provider, and we had to wait for I don't know how many months to get a
To get a
telephone when you needed
landline.
one.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Then they
actually saw that in the documentary
deregulated.
recently.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Henry.
I saw that in a documentary recently where the queues and the lines were just ridiculously long. And so ultimately people whereas people had internet elsewhere because it was much more competitive, it took a little bit longer because they wanted to like maintain control of the market, isn't it?
Yeah. And here that would be the shift where you say, okay, we are allowing competition, but the government still plays a role in maintaining the technical standards and supervising the technical standards that the government deems necessary.
Okay, but
You know,
right
so
now, this is where
moving
the
to the
government understands and has the technical standards, isn't it? Because sometimes where the government doesn't have nor understand what those technical standards are, then maybe, I don't know, they have to find a way to be able to manage it. Because if the government doesn't understand how data should be treated in order to promote competition whilst protecting consumer data and privacy, it's not a conversation that you can have because the first thing is for them to come to the realization that this is how it's done elsewhere and this is how we can potentially do it. So in that case, I think with what I have learned personally today is that you've made it evident to us that in the event that there is no alternative with those state-owned enterprises, then it's important to design policies that allow them to compete, because then it would ultimately lead to an improvement in the service, in the quality of the service, and in terms of price. So yeah, that was
yes.
a strong point for us, for me, because I imagine that some of the people watching who are the civil administrators, to them, it's not really privatization at all cost, right? And the first thing they do is like Madame Sonia Yoyo. The first thing at the Supreme State Audit, she sometimes works with us, she writes for us, and sometimes she would say, well, look at Baidu, look at Alibaba, look at Tencent, they were able to do that because they took the initiative to protect their markets. We are just like letting, you guys are here talking about Starlink and whatnot. How about we like make our own internet and make it better? But we just don't have the bandwidth nor the capacity, which is what I keep reminding them. We're not going to be the electric cars tomorrow, right? I mean, honestly, we
Yeah.
wouldn't. So
Yeah.
we need to find what we want to get better at.
And also look at the time when companies like Alibaba, Tencent were created. That was a time when the government in China also did not have the capacity to fully understand how to regulate data management, etc., and so forth. We have the same with a company in Indonesia, which is a unicorn called Gojek. It's a huge company that basically is a super app that has everything under one roof, and you can order anything you like through that app. That grew into a unicorn at a time when the business was not very regulated. And it became now the flagship company of the country. And it's the same with Tencent and Alibaba. They grew into their shape when the government wasn't quite there. And they are now basically the flagship companies of the country. And now the, all the countries are starting to say we need to regulate them. And it's the same in the United States. I mean, these giants grew at a time when the government was not capable at all to regulate it. That sets a very good example, If, as a government, you are not capable of regulating it fully, let them grow. You have sufficient you have sufficient rules to prevent them to enslave people, which there are concerns that certain ride-share companies would, enslave their drivers, etc. So there are rules against that. There's rules against fraud, and usually in countries there is a criminal procedure law, etc., and so forth. That's all there. So, but if now European Union again, and then they are now trying to set up all their Digital Services Act and their Digital Markets Act, etc. So they're trying to make sure no monopoly can actually, or no tech giant can actually monopolize the markets in the European Union. But they're doing it at a time when Europe doesn't have a company that would be able to do so. So why are there no such companies in Europe? Because
Sometimes I
the
wonder whether they
conditions
should
are
have
not.
just, yeah, the condition, is it that the conditions are not right? Or maybe, is it that the conditions aren't right? Or is it the fact that they were just dependent on, a DARPA reliance system from the United States? Because we always say that Europe somehow, yes, we can say that it is, the regulations are a lot, but if you compare the financial regulations in Europe and with that of the United States, they're about the same, right? You have budgets that go up to about 300 to 400 and something pages. Laws that extend to 167, 230 pages. They're about the same. So I wonder whether it's much more a question of will. And, for us here at CEPI, we are currently working with the European Commission as consultants for the global environment, for the EU value chain analysis for development, specifically for agriculture. And we're contributing the environmental consultants. And throughout that process, what I found is that the bureaucracy is really, is it the bureaucracy that's a problem, or is it the fact that certain steps can be digitized to make it easy for businesses to operate?
The government is able to facilitate the process of business creation to a certain extent by helping with digital solutions, etc. That's
Yes.
certainly the case. But I'm looking at a time in the 1970s when these companies started and grew to their shape. And at the time, you did not have hundreds of pages of regulations concerning data
Yes, of
management.
course.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yes, of course.
I mean, Elon Musk is one of the very few who is still innovating on a scale in the United States that creates new companies that are able to really can go out into the
Compete
world.
and yes, against the likes, against peers in China. That is true. But he's also been incredibly well resourced and well subsidized, right? So
Yes, yes, yeah,
which
absolutely. But
Which
at
begs
least
the question, can Blue Origin ever compete against a company whose business model is so integrated into EVs and also doing space rocket launches? Because it means that the EV business can kind of pay for the others, right? If it needs to. And they're
yeah,
just winding down the subsidies, because if every time you buy a car, you get a 7,000, you get a 13,000, you get a 23,000. That's not
yeah,
$23,000, $7,000 isn't small
yeah.
money, you know?
But Henry, allow me to take our conversation back to
Yes, yes,
countries like Indonesia or Cameroon, who do not have an Elon Musk, nor an Apple, nor a
yeah,
Microsoft, nor a Tencent or Alibaba. So, you know, when our problem in these countries is not so much how to deal with these giants, because if we block them, we lose the benefit of their products. If we block Elon Musk and all his companies, you will not get Starlink. And Starlink might be a good way for you to have competition against the state-owned internet
yes,
provider. So we cannot just say, no, we don't let them in because they're all government supported. Same with Alibaba and their payment systems, and Temu with their cheap delivery of goods, etc., and so forth. What we are talking about, and that is something we did in Indonesia, and I believe that's also something at the heart of Cameroon Economic Policy Institute, is you want entrepreneurs in the country to be able to grow and build their business and go out and compete in the world. And if you want that, you need a nurturing ground inside the country that allows them to grow. Go out of informal into formal. That's the one big step already. As you said, that's already very difficult with a 60% informal sector in Cameroon. That means 60% of the businesses do not dare to make that step into the formal sector. And that is not as big in Indonesia, but it's a similar challenge to the country. So here, I believe that's what we're working on. Never mind geopolitics and geoeconomics, etc. I mean, this is huge, and in a way, one needs to have an opinion about all of this. But this is not what's relevant to an entrepreneur in Cameroon.
yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
what matters is you want to build furniture in a town in Cameroon, and you want to set up a formal business. A government might be able to give you a single window kind of process where
Like a
you find a
24-hour.
website.
Currently, that process was built by the Europeans. They've built the platform essentially where you go, you register, you pay the fee that you have to pay to the government, and in less than 48 hours, you have all of your official documents that you have. But when you go to a state formalization center, it can take you up to 2 weeks. So
Yeah.
now the question with the Supreme State audit were like, oh, should such systems be under us? Will it be better managed? And to us, it was like, it doesn't really matter. If people can start their businesses and they actually have much more up-to-date statistics about the number of new businesses that are created, then, the formalization centers that can take up to 16 months before you get a statistic for the last 2 years or so.
Mm.
So but in the context of Cameroon, where it's 30 million people, you have a huge number of informal sector workers, especially in agriculture. Um, how do we ensure that the market actors in Cameroon, for example, the drinks company like SABC, and a few others, how do we ensure they don't become dominant? The reason I ask is because with this ELU value chain for development, what we do is when we look at the whole value chain for agricultural products, from those providing fertilizers, to those planting, to those harvesting, those transporting, those selling, those exporting. At each part of that value chain, there are about 4 or 5 actors. Like there's 4 or 5 companies that do refrigerated transportation in Cameroon. In each of those, that's what we've noticed. And so for fertilizer, some people think maybe it's a good idea for the 3 or 4 major producers to come together and then they can actually properly compete against someone else. But for the small producer here in Cameroon, I don't think that's necessarily a good idea, because now they have 4 buyers, one in the east, two in the northwest, and then one in the center and east in the center region. People have variety. And I've seen in the US that when fertilizer companies merge, the prices go up. And every survey that we see from late 2015 says that. So
Yeah.
yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, earlier in the conversation, I said one strong pillar of a competition policy is this abuse of market power. You can grow big, but you shouldn't abuse your power. And there are ways to make sure that doesn't happen. The second pillar of a competition policy is cartel prohibition. So, you cannot let those with a relevant market share again to form a cartel. Just what you said, if there are three and they go together, either merge or just form a cartel and say, okay, we split up geographically. You take this region, I take that region, and we talk to each other and we make sure our prices are
And
almost the same.
yes,
That's a cartel. And
uh,
who will suffer from this? The consumer, quite
consumer
clearly,
in the end, because
because
there'll be a flaw on the price, right? And
no more choice. No
yeah,
more choice. If in my region the other company just doesn't sell, and I am dependent entirely on the one supplier in my region, and that one company has a monopoly suddenly over this local market, and they charge whatever they like, then I, as a consumer, will lose. And that's a typical case of a geographical cartel, which you quite often have in mass products, cement, maybe fertilizer,
fertilizer
where the
meal,
product itself is relatively cheap, but what costs more is the distribution network, etc. And that's why quite often companies tend to say, let's make geographical limitations. I focus on this area, you focus on that area, and then they form a cartel. From a very strict free market perspective, the argument would be this is okay. This will go for a while and then they will start nevertheless falling apart and then they will start competing. This is a very laissez-faire argument to say, we don't care, let them do. But I'm a German, and in Germany we have a different history because in our case in Germany in the 1920s, we had very strong cartels of that sort and they had a huge political power. And so for us, it was a political power question. And therefore, in Germany, we have a different school, not the laissez-faire school, but what we call the ordo-liberal school, which is a school that would say, no, we need to enforce strong competition policy to protect the market from such politically linked, politically powerful cartels. And so we have a very strong so-called Federal Cartel Office, that's our antitrust authority, that would go after such cartels. We have that in sugar, for example. We had that among sugar would be a typical one for geographical cartel, but we have price cartels among petrol stations, for example, that would be a price cartel, etc. So all of this is prohibited as a second pillar of the uh, competition policy. And the third pillar is the one that you already mentioned, and that's merger control. So what I said earlier is it is totally fine to grow into a monopoly if it's just because you are better and consumers like you. So that's fine. Then you grow into monopoly, you just can't establish market entry barriers. Um, but if you grow into that monopoly by buying another company, and maybe you buy the only other competitor, then this
Like
is not a
Netflix and
natural
Warner
growth.
Bros., you know?
Yeah, exactly. If so suddenly establish a market power by merging with another large player, then the government at least would say in a competition system, this one we need to check. And then there are basically two systems. One is the pre-merger checking, and the other one is the post-merger. So in some systems, the government would say, before you merge, you have to tell us about your intention, and then we'll check it and we'll approve before you merge. And others would say you merge first, and we check later whether that's actually done according to our standards. and and both have their pros and cons. But nevertheless, merger control means if you try to grow into a monopoly or at least into an oligopoly, that means some companies dominate the market by way of buying another company, that comes under certain scrutiny again by the authorities.
So with merger and acquisitions, it's this gives the impression that they're almost certainly never always a good idea, right? Because it just means less companies in the market. And once they merge, even if if two companies who were competing before merge, and yes, there are some gains in terms of economies of scale and in terms of value for money, almost certainly they start pricing differently, right? So
No,
does
not
it mean,
always. I wouldn't, I
yeah,
wouldn't, I wouldn't go all that way with you, Henry,
okay, all right, all right, all right,
because it really depends whether how much will it affect competition.
okay.
So maybe two players merge, and they're already quite big, but they want to merge, but together they are still not able to control the market. Then that's okay. They should be able
Okay.
to merge because
So
then quite often you are,
if there are other actors and they don't have this
yes,
dominant control on say 90% of the market, then it is acceptable to merge. The most important thing is
exactly.
that other companies should be able to go into the industry, right, and still compete with them. Um,
That's right.
and
And for, uh,
And the other thing I wanted to find out is, when you have a company like Amazon, for example, when the company gets too big, ubiquitous, too big to fail, indispensable in everyone's lives, that's where presents are bought for Christmas, etc. When that happens, what's the role of competition now? Because it would be difficult to have another Amazon, right? eBay can barely keep up. And there are some other e-commerce spaces, that people who are aware use. But they'll rarely be able to compete with Amazon. And so in that case, how do you ensure competition is much more broad-based? Or how do you think about competition in such a context?
I mean, first of all, what I believe is in due process. You need to have crystal clear standards that you apply to everyone, not just to Amazon. So if you want to go after Amazon for certain things, you need to make sure you have them very clearly formulated. And that means any company that goes like Amazon would be subject to the same intervention by the government. It
Okay.
cannot just be because you think Amazon is a certain threat, you go after Amazon. Cannot be. And in competition policy, you would look at the concentration ratio, right? So there is C1, C2, C3, C4. This means how many companies are actually dominating the market. If you are the only one and you control, and this is different in different countries, but if you are the only company, you dominate more than 60, or you have more than 60% of the relevant market share, that means you have a dominating force in the market. Henceforth, once you are above the 60%, certain rules apply. So you have to be under certain scrutiny for what you do, so that you are not able to um, erect market entry barriers for others. So if you're below that 60%, these rules don't apply. But then they also look at C2, that means the two biggest companies and how much they are able to control the market. And if one holds 35% and the other one holds 45%, then together they have 80%. And they are again under heavy scrutiny because we have a duopoly now. That means if they want to do something significant, for example, merge yet again with another company, buy another one, that comes under scrutiny because they are already controlling the market. And then you have C3, that's the three biggest companies, etc. And what we at least have in Germany is that besides that antitrust authority that I mentioned already, they have judicial functions. So they can actually act like the first instant as a court. So they have the powers to send basically the investigators and confiscate files in a company if they believe there's malpractice in the company. But they are just the first instance. That means there's a second instance. That means the company will be able to appeal against the judgment of against the verdict of the Federal Cartel Office. And take it to the next level, and then a court, but a specialized court, a court that is specialized on competition issues, will then have to take it up on the next level. But besides all of this, which is a judicial process, we do have the so-called Monopoly Commission, and they are the ones calculating the concentration ratios. They are the ones writing the reports to the government saying, this sector is potentially subject to dominant control by one company or two companies. Here we raise an alert. In this sector, we want to be watching out. This could be any sector like the railway sector, the telecom sector, the chemical industry, etc., and so forth.
Transport, etc. So
Yes.
now for us, I think we've covered quite a bit there. Now for for us as institutions, it's important that we understand what that right level of competition is, right? Because if you can have one dominant actor in the market, but the products are so affordable and everybody likes them, and so it's not really a question of of the actor in that case. But for our markets who are still highly fragmented, for example, if you take communications, yes, it's a dominant provider, but there's so many roadside sellers of communication credits, etc. So a lot of the services are dominated by one actor. You have millions of other actors doing them. In that case, competition works effectively. But competition can only work effectively also does how much control or how much enforcement does the government need for competition to be effective? Because sometimes it was noticed in the past that when the government when policymakers reduce import subsidies on fertilizer, for example, people import fertilizer, but they go and they still sell it in the market at much higher prices. And so the government started sending agents to markets to go and check how much rice costs to ensure that the import duties are actually being applied. So, yeah, I mean, any ideas about how we can improve enforcement? And, is it something that the government should do, or is it something that technology can solve? And we're just a bit
Yeah,
slow.
thank you, Henry, because that brings me back to the very beginning of the conversation. That's what I'm trying to say. If you now, in a situation like this, the situation you described is almost identical to the one in Indonesia, where the competition authority is basically checking how are the government interventions working in the market and how are people using or abusing the system of subsidies. For example, prices that were set are not kept, people charge higher than what the government wants, etc. That's typically the case in a market that itself does not have competitive structures. So if you have fertilizer going in by a government controlled way, and then people see it, but since the government has not designed it efficiently, that means there's fertilizer reaching people who don't really need that fertilizer. Or they believe selling it on a black market actually can give them money, which is much more valuable than that fertilizer that they have just received. That means the distribution process of the fertilizer is not well designed in the first place. That means we do not have efficient markets for fertilizer in the country. And that's you cannot by strengthening the powers of a competition authority, you will not solve this. You need to then withdraw the government intervention into the fertilizer market to an extent where you have local fertilizer producers who are able to actually come in with their own products and maybe not the big, you know, chemical fertilizers which require huge industrial infrastructure. But at least the organic fertilizer might be able to actually be set up like a company and can enter the market. So you need some competition in the market. You need some players. You need some market structures in terms of producers, distributors, off-takers, etc., that need to grow. And if the system, the industrial policy prevents this from happening, then a strong competition authority will also not help. You know, first of all, you need a market economy in the country before you can then have a competition authority that's basically guarding that market economy. But the market structures need to be there in the first place.
Yeah,
And this is
yeah.
an issue we have in Indonesia as well, where we see time and again that the government does certain things. Fertilizers, for example, are often distributed for a political reason. They're distributed before elections. They're distributed in regions where the candidates in the political process might perceive a certain benefit by giving something to the farmers. This is not the way to get a fertilizer market running.
Um, right. So for our fellows, what we're going to be making them do is beyond just writing policy briefs, we're making them identify 5 to 10 people whom they want to share these briefs with. And we're making sure that they identify things in their local communities that they want to change so that we help them, apply these free market principles and, provide clear logical arguments to help policymakers make better decisions. So given, like I was saying before the call, Rainer, of course, mentored me a few years ago before I started CEPI. And a lot of the approaches that we were using back then of being very selective with the people who are in the room and making people want to come, making sure that we know who we want to reach, when and why, through what means, going to meet them to do short interviews, all of those are approaches that we've applied, which have worked for us. In the last 3 years, every single year, there is a direct link between our work and between policy outcomes. So
I want to congratulate you on this, Henry.
thanks.
Amazing
Thank
impact
you,
already.
thank you, thank you. We helped, we made policymakers reduce the value-added tax on locally made flour because we consume a lot of flour and we import a lot of it. So to encourage the uptake of locally made flour from cassava, plantain, it's better to reduce the VAT. And many of the farmers we spoke to, they're increasing their farm sizes because now they can sell to local bakeries who are also encouraged to use it. We've also, of course, gotten policymakers to put all of the export and import procedures for export and import online so that people don't go into an office and they ask them to pay a fee to receive those procedures. And this has been because we've been very, very focused in terms of our approach. It's just not been advocacy in the air. So for our fellows, I was wondering whether you have some advice for them, especially for those in the public sector, for example, whose colleagues are much more government oriented. What's your advice for them? And then maybe some advice for the entrepreneurs and the students.
I believe every country works on the premise that of their own history, their culture, their informal rules and traditions, all of this must be respected. So we're not talking about a market economy, free market economy as designed and described necessarily by Hayek or all the other big thinkers. These are our guardrails set by these thinkers. So they give us a direction. But where Cameroon is going depends on where Cameroon is coming from. And so whoever is in an administration, is in a policy making position, whatever level, needs to find their incremental growth. And that means you need to find the place where you can actually put the lever. And that is important. So if you can't say open up all the food trade of the country because that's unrealistic, that the country will not do, then you need to find, so where is the lever, where is the one regulation that can be changed for the better of the people? So what's possible, what's feasible within your context, that you can actually suggest and recommend to your peers in your ministry or in the administration that you are involved in. And then keep analyzing the benefits, work with CIPI and others here who can actually help you with getting the ammunition to say, if we change this in flour production, flour trade, or any other issue, that will bring a benefit. And then you change things step by step from within the system. And I think that's the best way forward. And also for think tanks, that's the best way to work. If you always just talk about the big picture, then you need a revolution before anything is that
Yes,
possible. But
yes,
that's not
of
what we
course.
want because that brings instability and chaos. And that's also what we don't want. So we need to have incremental step-by-step improvements. And I want to encourage those working with you inside the system to aim for that incremental growth, for that one policy that can be adjusted within a bigger picture. And for the entrepreneurs in your cohort there, in your fellowship, I would say go for your business and go for the profit that you can achieve, which is an amazing contribution to society because you are employing people, you are generating products and services that people need and want. And with this already, you are a bit of a hero of your society. So I think this is great what entrepreneurs do. But at the same time, keep the view a bit wider and see how, again, with an institute like that of Henry's, what are the more fundamental issues that you're facing and engage with the thinkers to say, look, my problem isn't so much the regulation that you are talking about, dear Henry. I'm actually facing another problem. And I've seen that in so many countries. When I discuss with entrepreneurs, they're telling me, what you're saying in a way is right, but that's not my biggest problem. My biggest problem is the export license that I need, or my biggest problem is when I go to the tax authority, or things that I might not be aware of. And so, as an entrepreneur, use the space that you have. And if you encounter challenges, then share those with Henry and others so that they can actually make it part of their analysis.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rainer, for taking the time. We are very grateful for you coming to share your thoughts with us. And
It's my
to
pleasure.
our fellows, I hope you've learned a lot from this video. This is going to be available on our YouTube page under the Free Market Fellowship series when the time comes. So we hope that it becomes a very, very useful resource to you. And Rainer, if our fellows want to connect, where can they reach you on X, on LinkedIn? What's the best way to keep up with your work?
The, the best is through LinkedIn.
Okay.
And since it seems I'm the only one with this name in the world, as long as they type my name, they will find me.
Yes, yes, yes. I always thought it was Rainer Hughes, but it's Rainer Heufers. And also, all this while, I thought you were in Indonesia, Rainer. I thought you were always in Indonesia, not in
I
Germany.
was until recently. I just
Oh,
relocated.
okay, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Perfect. So, well, and also, can I just say that you also lead the podcast for the Frederick Naumann Foundation? We listen to it in the office, of course, because we try not to only entertain ourselves. But can you tell us a bit about the podcast and
Oh, yes.
yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So the Naumann Foundation had, unfortunately, by now, an International Academy for Leadership, and this was a place where global leaders came together, also from Cameroon and many other countries, for leadership programs. And in order to continue the conversations after people have returned home to their countries, we started a podcast called Continued Conversations. And you'll find it on all relevant platforms. And here you have three different sets of conversations. There's one podcast team that would talk about management and leadership issues. There's a second podcast team that talks about the development of liberalism. And there is a third one, and that I am part of. And we're talking more about issues on the market economy and actual policy issues that need to be addressed, market economy, but also education policy. And we have conversations with interesting experts from all over the world, talking, for example, about the tech rivalry between China and the United States, talking about what is a liberal education policy, and so many other interesting conversations. So I warmly invite you to listen into our podcasts.
Okay, perfect. Well, I've been learning a lot. They've been, not just inspirational, but very, very like informative and really just challenges how we think about these things, which is very important. Because I think for the last since we started, we've been very focused on thinking whether our work really aligns with, the free market principles. But what I've learned today is that really the guardrails, and we just have to ensure that there are essential elements in addressing the problems of our local communities, because no one approach can be applied in the same manner everywhere. So it's about
Absolutely.
making it suit the local context to achieve an outcome that, of course, improves and advances prosperity. Well, Mr. Rainer Heufers, thank you so much for your time. And I don't think 1 hour 2 minutes is it's enough. I think if we can have this in the future and talk about other things, China and Russia and Europe and how and why they fell back. I think we want to have this conversation so that we can maybe learn a bit more from them.
Another continued conversation. It'll be my pleasure. Thank you so much for having
All
me,
right.
Henry.
Well, thank you so much, Rena. Speak to you very soon. Bye.
Bye.